Well, now son-in-law introduced me to Bitcoin, and he went over it 3 or 4 times before it began to sink in. But it sank in for a couple of reasons. One is I had been Wyoming's state treasurer, and we were investing monies from mining for oil, gas, and coal in a permanent mineral trust fund, the corpus of which is in violet. The interest, dividends, and realized capital gains were used for the state's legislature on its general fund. So I was investing that money. I was always looking in a diversified asset allocation that included income producing investments as well as stores of value, because we were taking minerals out of the ground, converting them to cash, and then we wanted to use some of the income now and then have them be in violet for the future. So we wanted to retain some store of value for future generations, even within this investment portfolio. So I was always looking for items within the fully diversified asset allocation that represented a store of value. So when my now son-in-law and other of his friends began explaining the store of value concepts of Bitcoin, it really resonated with me. And then the other concept was the concept of mining, because we had been literally mining coal, oil, gas, bentonite, uranium in different ways. You mine uranium in situ. There is no open pit. It looks like a few little beehives sitting out in a field that are pushing ions towards a well and mining that way. So different concepts of mining also resonated with me. So the fact that you mine it, the fact it's a store of value, and then now that the Lightning Network is here, that it represents an opportunity to further be a means of exchange is interesting. And then I had been in the Congress on the House side for 8 years. Right when I left, I was invited to speak at the Satoshi Roundtable, and the topic was, how does Congress work? And of course, thank goodness the topic wasn't Bitcoin, because I didn't know enough about it then. But that was in 2017. And that was a significant year for Bitcoin because there was a lot about the forks, Bitcoin Cash. It was a controversial meeting. It was in Cancun, so I thought, oh, this will be great. After 8 years in the House, I'll go to a beach. I never went to the beach. I sat in a room like this with no windows in Cancun for 2 days and just listened to the dialogue, the discussion among people. And I just found it so fascinating that that was my first real orange pill experience. And it has never worn off.
So, what do people miss? Whether that's members that you're speaking to or policymakers in the crowd, how is it that you have dove headfirst into understanding this technology and then, as we'll get to later on in the conversation, legislating on this technology? And I'll tell you firsthand from the Bitcoin Policy Institute, we've taken meetings with hundreds of different congressional offices. And I actually don't hear as much of, I hate this technology, it's bad. I hear a lot of, this technology is very interesting, we're open to it, but XYZ reason why they're skeptical. So, why is it that many others are open to innovation but skeptical? And maybe what are they missing about this technology that has allowed you to take the leap beyond that?
Well, it's thanks in no small part to you that people understand that this is interesting technology, because that in itself is a huge advance from where we were when I first arrived in the Senate. People didn't even know the difference between Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, other digital assets. They thought that maybe Bitcoin was uh, the Kleenex to cryptocurrencies are tissues. They thought they were all synonymous. And so it's taken a long time for people to understand that not all cryptocurrencies are alike. And as we've watched some of the failures in the last year that involved cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin, it has driven that point home. And further, having testimony in Congress from companies like Chainalysis, for those members of the Senate who think Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, Silk Road, criminal activity, drugs, and they kind of go down this mental inventory that they have when they think about it. You are helping dispel that. Chainalysis is helping dispel that. Law enforcement is helping dispel that. And so a lot of progress has been made by you. So I want to come here and personally thank you all for taking the time to educate your members of Congress and their staff. Your willingness to be very open with them about this technology has helped tremendously.
You mentioned FTX, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. We're 5, 6 months out of a $32 billion implosion and fraud. And I think we've seen many, both members of Congress, but people in general who were maybe curious or interested in this industry actually retreat in the 6 months since.
Mhm.
So I guess essentially, why are you up here on stage today at a Bitcoin policy summit when a lot of folks got scared off?
Yeah. Well, this has been a bit of a one step forward and two steps back experience. And there definitely were setbacks, even within the Congress, the Senate, especially on these issues, because it gave voice to some of our harshest critics. I try to remind people that the day after the courts became entrusted with the assets of FTX, there were no Bitcoin to be found. And there was a reason for that. That some of the cryptocurrencies that were created by FTX and some of the other cryptocurrencies that they held were easy targets for the commission of fraud. And so, in some ways, what happened actually helped do two things: validate the need for regulation in this space, validate what Senator Gillibrand and I have been trying to say to people, which is Bitcoin is a commodity. Bitcoin belongs at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Not all other cryptocurrencies are as open source, I'll use that word, as Bitcoin. Consequently, our focus in legislation has very much been on everything but Bitcoin, so that we can provide adequate consumer protection, adequate disclosures, and make people aware that, yes, there are fraudulent cryptocurrencies. And certainly there are companies that use legitimate cryptocurrencies in fraudulent ways.
Let's dig into this piece of legislation a little bit more. So, the Responsible Financial Innovation Act. This piece of legislation seeks to create some guardrails, essentially, that the industry knows that they can fit into. Right now, I think there's a lot of you hear this buzz phrase thrown around a lot, regulatory uncertainty, and it's basically companies just saying, "Tell us what we can't do," right? And rather than regulation by enforcement of saying, "Gotcha, you did something wrong," and companies going, "Well, we didn't know that was wrong." I think a lot of folks are just looking for some sort of clarity or certainty. So, could you walk us through what problems that your legislation is trying to solve?
We want to make sure that for cryptocurrencies that have more um, in common with securities, that the ability to custody and lend within the same business entity is not a good idea. That the disclosures that really the SEC is good at. They're good at shepherding disclosure for consumer protections. So we want to make sure that the SEC is involved, but not through enforcement actions, through the actual submission of information that can help a buyer, a consumer, make an informed decision. So that's going to be a big part of the bill, you see. There are, because of what happened with FTX and other companies, we're making a more robust penalty provision for illicit use and attempts to commit fraud on the consuming public. So our focus is very much not on Bitcoin, but on other cryptocurrencies. We are still working on the bill because the bill that we rolled out last year, which is very comprehensive and that we discussed a lot, then encountered the headwinds of the people you just mentioned that are still concerned about fraudulent use, about the need for a more robust regulatory environment that Senator Gillibrand and I originally crafted. So we're trying to beef up those areas of concern for members of the Senate and the House while still keeping an eye on innovation. And part of what's driving us to continue to move forward is what's happening in the European Union, in the UK, in Switzerland in particular, in Australia as well. The EU is ahead of us. And I've had people come to my office saying, get with it. When is your bill going to pass? We need the United States to lead on this, to participate in this, to be involved in this, to lay out your regulatory framework. So their desire is to see us join them so we have a globally understood network. And if we don't do it, you all are going to vote with your feet. I don't blame you. You're going to go where there's a regulatory certainty, a clearly understood set of sideboards and a framework that you can understand and work with. Instead of waking up finding about you're subject to an enforcement action by the SEC when you didn't think, when you thought you were in full compliance of U.S. law.
And you see this with the internet in many ways as well, is there are a lot of companies that are facing different regulations, across the world in different countries, and it's impacting whether those countries are actually going to continue to or those companies are going to continue to do business in those countries. And if you're having to do, 50 different things in 50 different countries, that makes it really hard for a company to flourish, especially a community like this, which you mentioned how much of it is open source. Yes, there are some big companies in the space, but there's also a large number of startups. There are individuals, running miners in their homes or running a Lightning node or just getting a startup off the ground with their friend, right? And I hope I speak for everybody here that we don't want to stifle that. One of the things that we've been talking about is how the United States greatly benefited from something like Silicon Valley and opening, tech, opening our arms up to tech and saying, we're the hub, right? Come here and we will help you all flourish and we will provide a breeding ground for innovation. And in many ways, I see, Bitcoin as the new Silicon Valley, right? If we open our arms to this industry, we can breed the same benefits that we did from Silicon Valley. I want to give you the opportunity. You mentioned some changes in this year's, reintroduction of the Responsible Financial Innovation Act. Do you want to touch on that anymore? Do you feel like you've said your piece? Feel free to. I think people came here to hear about this legislation. So anything else?
Okay. Well, I think you are going to see the consumer protections part being maybe twice as long as it was under the Responsible Financial Innovation Act. There will be some tax components, some penalty components, the clear separation of custody from lending. I, for one, am opposed to U.S. Central bank digital currency. Some other people are more favorable to it. So we had proposed a study of it. We may leave that on the cutting room floor going forward, but these discussions are still ongoing because the House Financial Services Committee, as well as the House Ag Committee on the commodity side, are more engaged in this than they used to be as well. And you heard, I understand, from some of those folks this morning, which is great. So we want something that will pass. I don't want to get in a spitting contest with the House of Representatives. I don't want to separate the House from the Senate, the Democrats from the Republicans. I want something that is workable for this industry that will not stifle innovation. And so I'm willing to sit down with almost anybody up the street who has an idea and wants to find a way to get to yes on this framework, because time is of the essence. And the frustration that you encounter in dealing with the regulatory climate here in the U.S. Is going to push you abroad if we don't get with the program.
As we wrap up here, you mentioned you're willing to meet with anybody off on the street. And I don't think Senator Gillibrand is just anybody off the street, but she's in a different political party than you. And so I think the final point I want to touch on here is this point of bipartisanship and pragmatism in your legislation. And I would also like to highlight the announcement from earlier today with former Congressman David McIntosh, who's a Republican, and former Congressman Tim Ryan, who's a Democrat, and partnered with the Bitcoin Policy Institute to create BPI Action to ultimately create a home for bipartisan discussion on these issues. I know you've done something similar with the Financial Innovation Caucus. So
Yes.
talk me through bipartisanship, both in your legislation, but generally as moving forward as an industry. How does that play a role?
Well, just to begin with, Senator Kirsten Sinema and I founded the Financial Innovation Caucus. It meets a couple times a month, brings in speakers, educates staffers. It's very staff focused. Some of you have come to speak to them to help deepen their understanding of this technologies and its capabilities. So thank you for that. Thank you for making yourselves available for those discussions. So that is the education piece targeting our staffs, because they are absolutely pivotal to the way these end products look. Then, as far as members go, I've had a heavy lift, but I think Senator Gillibrand's lift has been heavier because there's more resistance in her party to something that was not created by government and that government cannot control, because our parties take fundamentally different approaches to the merits and demerits of government control. I tend to look askance at government control, and her party has a tendency to look favorably on government control. And so she's had a much heavier lift than I. And she has been, a valiant advocate, and is just was the perfect person to have working on this. She continues to lead that effort. She has some heavy headwinds, but we're also making progress because we have gone together, and I have gone separately to meet with some of what I feel are our most hardened opponents. And we're softening them up a little bit. Now, there's a challenge in the regulatory agencies because I think Treasury was the tough nut to crack initially. And then it seemed like they were more receptive. And now, once again, they seem a little bit more challenging in terms of their concern about not being able to control something that is viewed as both a store of value and especially as a means of exchange. And the SEC has challenges because the industry has been faced with regulatory a regulatory heavy hand now. Enforcement actions are coming down in a way that I think has surprised some people. And so now that relationship has gotten kind of rocky. So the challenges with the federal agencies is going to, I think, ramp up as we move forward with this legislation. And of course, those federal agencies are all under a Democrat president, and Senator Gillibrand is going to be key to finding a way to craft the legislation in a way that she and I believe this industry can use and thrive, and yet um, work with the federal agencies that are going to be responsible for this regulation. Heavy lift, we're both going to stay after it and work hard on it. But I've heard her repeatedly say, this is the role of the United States Congress. This is legislating, this is policy making, this is our job. The executive branch is to implement the legislation, carry it out, but we make it. And so I'm just very proud of her strong advocacy for legislating in this area, because I do think that she's right about that. I do think we need to legislate and not just defer to the regulatory agencies to make this up as they go.
So, unfortunately, we're up against time. Would you like to close us out of the first annual Bitcoin Policy Summit? Any last thoughts?
Well, again, I want to thank you all for helping people understand the uniquenesses of Bitcoin. When you come and give examples to senators, representatives, and their staff about how this can help the unbanked, the underbanked, the underserved, those that lost money when SVB went down, when Credit Suisse encountered those problems, and the losses that we're now hearing about at First Republic. I mean, if that money was in Bitcoin, yeah, the value fluctuates. And once, hedging becomes more mature and the asset comes more mature, some of those highs and lows will begin to also smooth out. But the point is, their money would still have value. And when people start realizing, I can put money in a bank, but I can only put $250,000 in an insured account, that the limits of fiat currency and banking and fiat currency as a secure and safe asset have also kind of been revealed and disclosed to people. So there are people that are looking towards safe places, safe harbors for money. And a lot of the wealthy people are using like overnight repurchase agreements or, notes. But you have to be pretty sophisticated to access those markets or have a lot of money. You don't need to be sophisticated or have a lot of money to have your own private wallet, to transfer money from a son who's working in the U.S. to his mother who's living in El Salvador. The remittances are happening. The transfers of money between people who want to help Ukrainians is happening. And when you can explain those real-life cases for how these assets can help individual people control their own money and have an asset that is going to withstand the test of time, and Bitcoin will. I don't know if the others will, but I know Bitcoin will. You will have done something good, not only for making the case for regulation, but making the case for how important this asset is going to be globally to people of all means, the rich, the poor, the banked, the unbanked, the Native Americans who don't trust non-Indian banks, the people that live in governments that are corrupt. It's a way for them to have their individual sovereignty and have their hard work protected. That's the wonderful story about Bitcoin. Thanks for telling it. Thanks for sharing it. Your work in these regards is truly meaningful. So thank you very much.